Hello, my friends of sophisticated color. Today we are covering our first intermediate topic. It will be a shorter session and we're covering one of the not so often used color tools in FilmLight, which is a boost color. Still, I think it's always good to have a good understanding about all the tools that we have to our disposal. And I would say, let's get started. And please, as usual, ask questions live in the chat or comment below the videos. All right, let's have a look at the Boost Color tool in FilmLight. But first, to get a better understanding of the use cases for the tool, let's have a quick look at a classic saturation operator in FilmLight. So I used the film grade saturation tool, but this is working similar to the video grade saturation, for example. When we add a lot of saturation to a shot, like I'm doing here now, we often run into similar problems. One is that overly saturated colors quickly blow out and really look nasty in the image. The other problem is that flesh tones also quickly get unnaturally oversaturated. While we might like what's happening here in the background on the sky and the tree and the houses, these faces and these super saturated oranges, they really don't look nice anymore. So that's a problem with the classical saturation algorithm because it treats all colors in the same way, and very saturated colors are pushed into higher saturation even faster than low saturated colors. And this is one of the main use cases of the Boost Color operator. We can find it in the Color submenu in the Insert menu. Here's the Boost Color, which means that Boost Color can be baked into 3D LUTs. When you export LUTs, you can use Boost Color as one of the tools. So all of the operators inside that menu here can be baked into 3D LUTs because these are what technicians call per pixel operations. Okay, now I inserted it and the amount of parameters is not too big. It's a quite straightforward tool. So the most important slider here is the saturation gain. So I'm now raising the saturation gain in Boost Color, and notice the difference to what we just saw with the classic saturation algorithm. Now we get a nice boost in saturation here in our background, for example, but the highly saturated colors are not boosted up that heavily, and also the skin tones stay more natural in the default setting of the tool. So this is already the main message here, what you can use the tool for. I would say it's mostly usable for look development if you are aiming for very colorful, vibrant looks. But yeah, you want to avoid these common pitfalls that I just showed with normal saturation algorithms. Then you could consider playing with Boost Color as an alternative. One thing I should mention is that the Boost Color operator is not color managed. That means it reacts differently depending on the working color space it is applied in. So if I'm switching here the stack color space of my shot, for example, to a linear one or to different log working color spaces, we can see slight differences in the colors. The differences are not too big, but you should be aware of that behavior. All right, so what else can we do here? So let's examine the advanced parameters. Or first, to get a better overview of the reaction of the tool, I switch my viewing color space to my working color space. So now the image here in the viewer looks wrong. So now we see our T-log image here in the output, but now we can examine the behavior of the tool without the DRT on the output side affecting the colors. So what we can see is if I'm increasing the saturation gain, that mostly the unsaturated colors or mid-saturated colors are boosted up, and the more strongly saturated colors are moving slower. The next thing is the red bias. With the red bias, we can adjust the strength of our red color vector here, moving towards the red primary. So if I increase that, you can see that now the reds get more saturated, and if I keep the value lower, the reds are not pushed outwards that much. Let's put it back to the default of 0.1. The blue bias works a little bit differently, so it's not only moving the colors towards the blue primary, but on the whole, on both sides of the blue-yellow axis. Watch how that works. So now we can see here, so if we increase the blue bias, we are increasing the saturation on the blue and yellow scale. So this affects a lot of the colors in the image. But what we can't influence with these two biases is the saturation of cyan here, and let's say the cyan green corner. This one is only determined by the saturation gain. Okay, so let's see how that looks with the real output colors. So if I increase the red bias, we can see that, yeah, now we're getting a stronger red color, and then if we overdo that, we have again might run into similar problems that flesh tones get overly saturated, or the here these orange-red colors are getting too saturated in the image. And when I move the blue bias, you can see that we can increase the overall saturation both in the blue and in the yellow direction, and notice how these kind of more greenish cyan colors stay mostly untouched in the image by that. One thing I want to warn you about is moving the saturation gain to negative values. You can use small negative numbers, maybe to decrease the saturation of an image, although I would always use another tool for that. But if you do really strong corrections in the negative area, you can see that the colors, for example, the greens, they are folding over into the opposite direction. So what was cyan green before is now turning orange. I mean, this might be an interesting desaturated look for one of your projects, but just be careful about that. It might introduce some unwanted effects. And if we're now, for example, increasing the red bias, we can now also see the red colors folding over into the green direction. So this is something that I would definitely be careful with. Okay, let's move on to the next shot. Here I'm inserting boost color. Let's increase the saturation gain. If we go all the way up to 1.0, then we realize it's definitely a little bit oversaturated here for the sky and the car, etc. So let's bring it back a bit. But here we have a lot of yellows and greens in the image. So I think we can definitely try raising the red bias here to also boost up the colors in that angle a little bit further. And we can see it's definitely helping the woman's skin tone here in that example. So let's go back a little bit further with the saturation gain. And I think we get to a nice before-after example here. On the next shot, we have a similar example, a lot of yellow and orange tones in the image. And if I raise the boost color a lot, we can see we have that tendency of the yellows feeling more greenish compared to the uncorrected example. So here I would definitely also raise the red bias to counter that. And now we might end up with an overly saturated image. So let's dial it back a little bit, maybe something like that. And then we might come to a point where we're happy with. On the next shot, we have a lot of greens in the image. When we raise the saturation gain, now we should realize that the amount of green is limited by the saturation gain. This is what I mentioned before. So if I'm raising the saturation gain here very high, then even if we touch these sliders here, we have a small effect on the greens, but in general, the amount of saturation in the greens is defined by the saturation gain. And with this one, we can then just define the stretch in that blue-yellow axis, as I explained earlier. So if we're now thinking the greens are overly saturated, the only way
to recover there is lowering saturation gain to a more healthy level, then maybe raising the red a little bit, and with the blue yellow bias we can then add something on top. And this is then the before and after. But here we can see that if the green is here quickly going out of hand, also brightness wise, then boost color might not be the best tool for that. And the last thing I want to talk about is order of operations. So here I have a shot which has a little bit of a yellow greenish color cast uncorrected. So in my layer 1 I corrected that with base grade balance. Please refer to the base grade tutorial if you want to learn more about that. There I also showed the same shot and how I balanced it. And now we're adding a boost color below. So base grade balance is applied first to neutralize the shot, and then we're boosting up the colors. Here again I would say we have a little bit of a tendency now of two yellowish casts in the warm tones, so I would maybe raise the red bias a little bit. Yeah, that I think looks much more healthy. Definitely still overly saturated, so I'm dialing it back a bit. And now we come to this result where we are probably quite happy. The overall before after looks like that. But what if we change the order of operations now? When I move the boost color strip above layer 1 with Alt up arrow, we get a completely different result. So now we're doing the boost color first on the uncorrected image, and then we're balancing it back to neutral. We could definitely try to adjust our color balance here, but in the end the result will be a bit different. So always think about the order of operations, and generally my advice would be to first neutralize the shots technically and then boost up the saturation, especially with nonlinear tools like boost color. The last thing I want to mention are the extended ranges. So you can activate them on the bottom here, and then we have a much larger range for the boost color, but you can also see that on most shots you will then get really overly saturated and not really pleasing looking images. So definitely be careful with the extended ranges, and I personally would use them only very, very rarely. In general, I can say I'm using boost color not that often. I think we have also other nice alternatives available in FilmLight, but it's always good to know the full arsenal of tools that you have available in FilmLight. So when you run into a specific problem and a specific task, then boost color might just be the right tool to fix it.
Yeah, so we had a question during the session about the differences between boost color and the other saturation tools that we have available in FilmLight, for example, base grade, or we could also compare it. I also quickly compared it in the session to the one from film grade. And to sum it up, I would say all algorithms work a little bit differently. So the base grade saturation works more similarly to the film grade one, but it's color managed, so it always works in the same. It always has the same fixed behavior, and it's not dependent on the working color space. And it's also optimized to have a more perceptually uniform response. And generally, I would say the boost color I would only use as a small ingredient for some vibrant looks. Sometimes you might put it in to get that vibrant, more saturated look. I would always use it only to add more color intensity to the image and not to desaturate. And the other saturation tools like base grade or film grade, you can also use, I would also use on a shot-by-shot basis, and also to desaturate shots. And one thing that I didn't show during the session, which I forgot, and let me do that quickly now, is how to put boost color into a layer, because in this presentation, I only used it as a single strip in the stack, and typically you would not do that. So instead of inserting it directly as a strip into the timeline, what I would typically do is I would create a layer and then choose one of the existing operators, for example, curve grade, right-click, change operator type, and then insert boost color. And that way you can customize your own special layers in your grading stack. So it's also possible to have all layer 4s in each stack have a different set of operators, for example. That's all possible via the customize menus. All right, so thanks for staying with me today and following that tutorial. I hope it was helpful, and the next ones will be done by Bob again, and I hopefully see you soon for one of my next ones. Thanks, bye.